Okay, now we're recording. All right. We don't need my introduction anyway. That's better. This is probably a good point. I've already put processing up here to mention that, dealing with any sort of animal husbandry, livestock production, we're going to talk about life and death and disease. There are some photos in this presentation that are maybe a little bit gross. I've tried to make sure that the gross ones are things that I've personally taken, and I'll try to give you a heads up, but just I don't know if there's young kids watching along with you or you're a little bit squeamish yourself, just a heads up that there might be a couple of gross photos and definitely some photos of processing itself. So moving right along, some of you that are here might be new to conservation districts. So at the beginning of every webinar and every workshop that we put on, we like to talk about what conservation districts are. So there's one in basically every county in the United States, although the organization is somewhat different depending on where you are in the state. Conservation districts were created in the 1930s out of the Dust Bowl. They really were created as a way to prevent a similar sort of man-made natural disaster from ever happening again. So the purpose of conservation districts really is to manage natural resources to help farmers and landowners, both rural and urban, to manage their natural resources. Here in Pierce County, west of the Cascades, that primarily looks like maintaining soil and water quality. We're especially focused on water quality in this part of the world, trying to keep those salmon healthy and make sure that we're minimizing the runoff that goes into the Puget Sound from our agricultural activities. And we do that in a bunch of different ways. So Pierce Conservation has a number of different programs. So Marley and I are part of the farm assistance team. So we go out and work with farmers of various size and scale and livestock and crops to help them achieve their natural resource goals. We also have our water quality team that works a lot with urban restoration, riparian zone restorations, things like that. We have a habitat team that also does a lot of restoration projects. If you've had a chance to go out to the South Prairie Creek Preserve, you know how lovely it is. If you haven't, I suggest trying to find a work party and getting out there. It's just a beautiful part of South Prairie Creek that the Conservation District has been able to conserve. We also have our Harvest Pierce County team that does a lot of gleaning products for local food banks as well as runs community gardens. Our environmental education team, which right now is in the process of managing, I think, 20 schools with their own tanks full of salmon. And then we have our climate resiliency team, which works both in fire prevention and also with solar projects. So lots of different things happening here at the Conservation District. And I encourage you to stay in touch and see what all the Conservation District can do for you. Talking about farms specifically, the farm team provides technical, educational, and financial assistance to landowners and property managers. Depending on where you live in the county, you're able to get a farm visit out if you're in one of our focus watersheds. We can do soil testing and give you all sorts of different advice on how to apply nutrients to prevent runoff and maximize production. And so the farm team is just a really great resource and a good starting place for looking for other resources. We want to try to get you from this. So the photo on the left is kind of a runoff prone compost pile to something that looks more like the picture in the middle, which is a nice, beautiful compost bin. And that's something that we can actually help cost share for qualified landowners once you have a farm plan with us to be able to build something like that to be able to manage your manure better. So with that being said, we'll jump into kind of the heart of the presentation. And we wanted to start off just by setting the expectation of what what we're trying to achieve here, and that is happy, healthy people, animals, and environment. So we want to make sure that your animals are well taken care of. That's part of being a good steward of any sort of livestock. We also want to make sure that you're having a good time and that it's fun for your family and managing and manageable for your operation. And then, of course, we at the Conservation District care a lot about soil quality, soil health, water quality. So we want to help you to design your operations so that you can protect the natural environment and in some cases even enhance the natural environment, which can be really cool. And then I also just wanted to give a quick sort of vocab lesson. If you're new to the world of poultry production, there can be words, and I'm sure there's some that I will say that I haven't put on this list that you might want to be familiar with. So please, again, feel free to stop me. For chickens, we have layers, which are birds that are raised to lay eggs. Broilers, that typically refers to a bird that's produced for meat. Rooster is a male. A hen is a female. You might hear the word capon, which is a castrated male, although that's kind of gone out of fashion because the castration process is pretty gnarly. But it's possible that you'll run across that. Chicks, obviously, are baby chickens. Pullet might be a new word for you. Pullets are kind of like teenage chickens. So it's that age between chick and adults. And hens in this age will start laying, but sometimes their eggs are smaller, less frequent. They have a hard time controlling kind of the frequency and size of the eggs that they're producing at this stage. And then at the end of life, we have spent hens or stew hens, which you might hear, you might see in the grocery store as packaged. And those are just adult laying hens that have kind of reached the end of their productive laying life, and have been processed to be used for meat. Turkeys, we've got toms and jennies. Poults are baby turkeys. You may have seen them at Tractor Supply. I think Chick Days is going on, and they're pretty stinking cute. So those are baby turkeys. Ducks, we have drakes and hens, or also known as ducks, and then ducklings, obviously. Geese, goose, gander, goslings are the babies. And then just a couple other terms. A hatchery is a facility that produces chicks, so they'll incubate and hatch out eggs. You might hear a breed referred to as being sex-linked. So there's commonly red sex-links. That's a pretty common production breed of laying hen. And what that means is that when the chick hatches, they come out a specific color based on what their sex is, so whether they're male or female. And this is just a way for commercial hatcheries to really easily sort out if they're trying to send batches of hens that are only females. Conversely, I didn't put it on here, but you might hear chicks referred to as straight run. That's kind of the opposite, where straight run chickens are ones that are sort of mixed genders. So you may end up with more roosters if you're purchasing straight run hens or straight run chickens. Heritage breeds are basically the livestock equivalent of heirloom. They're a more traditional historical breed. Hybrid is a mix of two breeds. Interestingly, sex-linked animals are all hybrid. You also may hear about broad-breasted, and those are animals that have been bred commercially to grow really quickly and have a lot of fleshy breast meat because that's very popular for eating. And then processing might refer to the whole slaughter process, or it might just refer to eviscerating, plucking, or parting out pieces. And I'm particularly bad about using processing and slaughtering interchangeably. So sorry about that. And then lastly, brooder is kind of where chicks live for the first parts of their life. It's a nice, warm, safe area. And we'll talk more later on about what makes a good brooder if you want to go through raising animals from the chick stage. So the big questions. This is really where I would encourage any sort of new producers or people who are thinking of adding an additional poultry enterprise to think about and spend a little bit of time considering these questions. For me, the big questions are why. You want to have a good motivation for why you're doing this, and there's lots of different reasons. For some people, it could be to save money. You've probably seen that the price of eggs is really high. Um, Unfortunately, the price of chicken feed is also really high, so the save money thing might not be as sort of one-to-one as you think. Some people just want to know where their food is coming from or how it's raised or teach their kids or just gain experience. It can be a way to feed yourself so that you're not dependent on, what's available at the Fred Meyer. Definitely the COVID-19 pandemic showed us that shortages are a real thing. And so, being able to be independent of that system can be really appealing to a lot of people. In terms of a business, if you're adding a new chicken enterprise or a turkey or something else, it's probably to make money or diversify your assets. Chickens, as I said before, in particular, can be an easy way to start a farm business or a first enterprise for people or for young people to start an enterprise, whether that's eggs or broilers, because it's relatively low cost for the infrastructure compared to kind of what you can sell. It's kind of like the gateway livestock almost. Um, so that's definitely a valid reason. And then of course there's land considerations. Some people like using poultry of various species for pest control. They're great at controlling bugs and potentially breaking up parasite cycles in other animals. And then of course, like any animal, they poop a lot. um, and poultry manure in particular is higher in some of the key nutrients like nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus than some other livestock. So they can be a good way as part of an overall operation to improve the productivity of your land and your grasses. So once you've got your why, you want to think about who, whether it's a business or just for you personally. Chickens, especially laying hens, are a full-time 24/7, 7 days a week commitment. So you want to think about who it is actually going to be taking care of them. Do you go on vacation? Is there somebody that can take care of your chickens while you're on vacation? Obviously, for broilers or something else, or even laying hens, there are people that kind of cycle through a flock every year. And so you can take the winter off. But then, that's its own consideration. You have to find processing resources. And then especially for, I would say, backyard poultry owners and commercial poultry owners too, you want to have a good connection with your vet, just to make sure that if anything goes wrong, and something inevitably will go wrong at some point, you want to already have a relationship with that person, especially now because there's just so few vets that deal with livestock, that you kind of want to make that relationship before you need it. And then the next big question is, what are you interested in raising? And part of that can be based on, your lifestyle. Again, like I said, whether you want to be free during the winters or not. Are you interested? Do you eat meat? Do you eat eggs? Do you have people that you want to share them with, or do you want to sell them? And then there's other considerations about like what types of species, and that can depend on what level of production you want. Like, do you want 1 million eggs, or do you want really big chickens, or would you rather have sort of a more closely related chicken to its natural ancestor, but maybe that means less meat production, less egg production. And a lot of those things go the same way, whether it's ducks or turkeys, geese, guinea hens, whatever it is. And then the last consideration is, what age of an animal do you want? How long do you want to have them for? And so forth. So we'll dive a little bit more into some of these questions. So mentioned pest control. That's probably something that some folks here have heard about. Chickens are great for cleaning up pests, whether it's grasshoppers, worms, slugs, bugs, fly larvae, mosquito larvae. I've even heard people that I'm from Arizona, and so there's people in Arizona that have them as scorpion control because chickens are like miraculous and they can grab scorpions and do away with them without harming themselves. So that can be a good option. Some people like that for helping with their gardens, but then there's sort of a food safety trade-off that you have to consider, when having poultry around ready to eat, especially food products. The photo that we have here on the left is some sheep grazing with chickens. Some folks like to graze poultry and ruminant animals together. You can see that chicken brushing through the manure piles that had been laid down. Looks like they probably had cattle with them too, and so the chickens can be used to, eat the larvae or any worms that might be in the poop and try to control the overall parasite load of their animals without relying on synthetic dewormers that can be detrimental to other beneficial insects in the environment. And they help obviously break up the manure piles, as you can see there. And that can be a good way to spread nutrients in addition to both controlling for parasites and also controlling for bacteria. Sunlight is an incredible sanitizer, so the act of even just breaking up those manure piles can really help you control both your larger and small pest loads. Another reason that I wanted to show a little bit of data on is the idea of using chickens as fertilizer or as fertilizers. So if we look here, broiler litter, lots of nitrogen, especially compared to something like horse manure. You can have a really, really great manure from your chickens, whether you're free ranging them, putting it directly on the pasture, or collecting it and composting it. The composted values are a little bit lower, just because there is some loss during the composting process, whether it's to volatilization or leaching. But poultry manure is really up there as one of the best fertilizers. And maybe you decide that you don't want to do your own chickens, but you know somebody that has them, or you know somebody that is connected with a processing facility or with a hen house. You can get really great fertilizer from poultry sources for your other operations or for your personal garden. Again, keeping in mind that you want to make sure if you're using it on ready-to-eat products that it's fully composted so that the bacteria, particularly Salmonella, have a chance to die before you put them on those sorts of products. So that's a couple reasons why you might be interested in poultry products. Um, and so we'll kind of skip over the who, because I feel like that's pretty personal and something that you really need to consider for yourself and what your personal situation and your family situation is like, or what your farm staff wants if you have a farm and farm staff. So we'll turn back to kind of the what and talk a little bit more about different species and different breeds. So this picture probably looks a lot like chickens, but they're not chickens. So these are red jungle fowl. So chickens, if you don't already know this, are a jungle creature. They're a domesticated relative of different jungle fowl, typically from different parts of Southeast Asia, depending on what type of chicken you're talking about. Resemblance seems pretty clear. But what that means, whether it's chickens that are jungle fowl or ducks, we know are waterfowl, they like to be in and out of water. Turkeys are native to the United States, and they typically live in kind of woodland areas, some open savanna. But what that means, as descendant of these wild animals, is that they have natural instincts. And I think in a lot of cases, um, if you're interested in producing your own food, you maybe are turning away from industrial agriculture. And one of the issues commonly cited against industrial agriculture is that it takes away the ability of those animals to express their natural instincts. And that's something that I think is really cool about raising your own animals, is that you have the opportunity to allow, if not even encourage, the animals from using their own instinct. I've had good farm mentors that have said that, every animal on your farm should have a job. And the job is basically like what they like to do. So chickens, they're good scratchers, peckers. Obviously, that helps with the manure that we just talked about. But they can also have less desirable natural instincts. So dust bathing is a way that chickens keep themselves clean. Um, but it can also create like holes in the ground and lots of sort of bumpy surfaces from the dust bathing. And then chickens, of course, they like to roost. So giving them the opportunity to roost is a great thing, depending on how you decide that you want to raise your animals, what sort of structure. They may all have influences on what you decide is important to you. Ducks, similarly, they like water. They got to have water in their areas, and it's going to get messy. Ducks are kind of a little bit messy. So you want to think about, like, can I provide, a kiddie pool for them, or something where they can express their natural instincts, but in a way that isn't, destroying your property or anything like that. And then turkeys, similar to chickens, they like to roost. So being up off the ground for turkeys is important. And then particularly in the brooder, turkeys are really curious. And so people put out, I don't know, like CDs on chains or other sort of toys for the turkeys to play with. And that just helps prevent them from pecking at each other. So keeping in mind, where your birds came from, who they descended from, I think can be an important part to deciding what species is right for you and your situation and for your farm, so that you can be a really good husband, and really good animal husband, and encourage their natural instincts. Another thing to consider would be the lifespan. So broiler chickens, depending on the breed, will be processed at 8 to 16 weeks. Turkeys, 16 to 28, longer than that. Ducks and geese vary a good bit. And with ducks and geese, you really want to try to get them and process them during a specific molting stage, so that they're easier to pluck, makes a nicer product. So meat birds, you can choose the breed that you're interested in depending on how long you want to raise them for. Obviously, that ties into, how much feed you're going to use, what the cost of that is. So again, like everything, it's kind of a trade-off between what your values are, why you're doing this. Am I doing this because I need to make an income stream and so I want to maximize production, or am I doing this because, I just want the experience, and maybe then you can do a longer lived bird. These are the sort of questions that I would encourage you to ask yourself as you go about deciding what species, what operations are right for you. For laying hens, I think this is a really cool graphic. So heritage hens live up to 8 years. I think the oldest living chicken was 16 years old. And I definitely have a friend in Yelm that has her childhood chicken. So it's probably up there in the teens age. So just a note to be prepared that, if you're not planning on processing these chickens, that especially if you get a heritage breed, they can last a long time. And one really key thing to note is the difference between these two columns. So this is the lifespan and this is the laying period. So most chickens, and I think the same is true for ducks, have a sort of primary period of their life where they're laying a lot of eggs. And then egg production tapers off. Egg production tapers off in the wintertime, and it may come back the next year depending on the breed. And you may still get an egg every now and again, but instead of getting like one egg every day and a half, or one egg even every day for some really productive breeds, you might get one a week, and then like one every couple of weeks. And keep in mind that throughout that time, you're still paying, to feed these animals, you're still taking care of them. And so that's definitely something I'd encourage you to consider is what you're looking for. Are you looking for a pet? Are you looking for a food production animal? Are you looking for some combination of the both? And try to decide, what's right for you then. And that kind of leads to everybody's least favorite topic, end of life care. So for a lot of birds, that means processing. If you're planning on getting chickens or ducks or geese or whatever in Pierce County, I will tell you that there is one processor that does outside birds in Pierce County, and they are extremely busy. We do have equipment to rent from PCD, but especially if you're planning to get some sort of meat bird, before you even decide to order from the hatchery, at this point, just the way that the processing infrastructure is, I'd really encourage you to schedule out your processing dates before the chicks even arrive. And you can kind of base that based on sort of the average growth rate of the breeds that we were just talking about. But yeah, just a fair warning that processing is very dear and hard to come by these days. There's a lot of funding coming from the federal government right now to try to improve the processing supply chain, but we're still probably at least several years out from seeing big impacts in that age. Some folks choose to euthanize their birds, and that's an option. Some folks just wait and let their birds die naturally, whether that's from old age or disease or predators, and that's certainly an option. And then some folks do plan on relocating them, whether that's to somebody else's farm or to a animal sanctuary. I think that's a valid choice, and one that can be really great for both you and the animals. But at the same time, I would caution folks to stay away from situations like this. This was a turkey that I processed up in Carnation that had passed sort of from two different families' hands. There was some moving, and it just ended up being really, really big. There just wasn't a strong a strong thought of what should happen to this turkey. And so yeah, he got almost too big to walk, and you can see the finished product sitting on the scale there. It's almost too big for a scale. He clocked in at 50 pounds bagged weight, and kind of a typical turkey would be around, I don't know, 16 or so pounds. And I wanted to put this in here as sort of a tale of caution that but I think for the animal's benefit, it really is important to think about kind of the entirety of the lifespan. All right. Any questions so far, or comments, concerns? Yeah, so there was a question about turkey sizing and how small you can process them, and definitely as kind of whenever you want to. There's really more of an upper limit to when you can process them because they start getting tough. Whereas um, you can process them younger than that. I can't remember off the top of my head kind of what the expected live weight to meat weight ratio is, but that's definitely something that you can look up online to see what the shrink would be between live weight and process weight. So you can kind of gauge when to process them based on how big they are as a live animal, for sure. All right, so now the fun stuff. Regulations. So we'll start And just a shout out to anybody here that's not from Pierce County. I'm sure similar regulations exist in your county. You also almost certainly have a conservation district to get in touch with that can hopefully help you with that. But we'll talk just a little bit for those specific to Pierce County about things that you need to be aware of before you start, especially before you start building anything. The Pierce County Code. I apologize. This is an extremely boring slide, but I think it's pretty effective. So these are all of the chapters of the Pierce County Code. And these are all of the ones that you may interact with when you're thinking about doing livestock. So business licenses, whether you can have animals, construction permits, just a reference of all the different things and kind of a cautionary tale that you want to get in touch with Pierce County before you start making changes to your land, especially if you plan to have something that will need to be permitted in the future, like a house or a barn or something bigger, it's easier to go through at the beginning and start everything out on the right foot than try to retroactively get permits for some of these things. Particular things to check, definitely what your zoning is. And whether your zoning allows you to even have livestock. There's different regulations and it's different for different community plans. Different cities obviously have different regulations about how many livestock you can have based on the size of your property, based on where it is, whether or not that can be your primary use or has to be an accessory use. I won't bore you with all the details, but I would encourage you to look up your zoning. And Pierce County has a really great website called Public GIS where you can look up different information about your property right on the internet. And I'll share a link to that site either in the chat, if Marley, maybe you could do that, or definitely in the follow-up. Another thing to consider is whether you have a critical area. There's lots more regulations around critical areas like wetlands or streams, creeks, etc., that can limit what you can do with livestock and what you can do in terms of building, putting in impermeable surfaces, that sort of thing. You also might need a site development plan depending on what your plans are. And then of course, if you're building a large building or even any building over 200 square feet, you might need a building permit or at least a signed affidavit saying what it is. But there's help out there. So Pierce County has a nice website that has all these cool fact sheets like this, like how to get started with livestock. And then there's two guys at the Pierce County Agricultural Planning Department, Mike Petit and Dean McClary, who are probably the two most helpful people in the entire county and can help you get set up and walk through and talk through different scenarios. They're really great at hypotheticals, so very helpful for helping you walk through the permitting process from start to finish. Really encourage you to reach out to them if you're doing any sort of development on your site. There's also potentially local restrictions. I think somebody in the chat mentioned that they haven't had chickens before because of HOA regulations, and that's definitely a concern. If you're in one of the cities as well, you should check your city ordinances because some of them don't let you have any sort of poultry. Some cities restrict you from having, roosters. So definitely something to check. It's very site specific, so I don't want to go through kind of every different town's regulation, but you can usually find them on the Chamber of Commerce or city websites. So then we'll talk about Washington state regulations. So primarily, you're going to run into Washington state regulations when you're dealing with products. So for eggs, if you want to sell them, they all have to be clean in clean containers and stored at a specific temperature. If you're selling them on the farm and from your own flock, you don't need a license. You don't need an egg handler or dealer license, But the moment that you start selling them off the farm, so whether that's at a farmer's market or somewhere else, or if you're combining eggs from some other flock and packaging them together or something, then you have to have a handler dealer license, which comes with regulations about, you know, what your facility needs, temperature requirements, water requirements, bathroom requirements. And then there's also packaging requirements, lots of labeling requirements. And that's just a way, these regulations are really based on kind of presumed risk. So the thought behind this is that if you're only selling off your farm, you're likely selling to fewer customers. And so the risk is lower that somebody would end up with a foodborne illness. But then as you sort of ramp up production, sell off farm, you're subjected to more regulations. And they can definitely be a pain. Um, but food safety, obviously is important. And a lot of these regulations, all of the regulations are spelled out both on the WSDA website, and WSU Extension through their Small Farms program also provides a lot of information on these things. On the meat side of things, Washington state regulations is that you can sell whole fresh birds on your farm from your own flock, up to 1,000 birds a year, just by getting a special poultry permit. Now you can process your own birds for your own consumption, not for sale, without a permit. But if you are going to sell them, there is a permit. If you sell more than 1,000 birds, you actually have to go through the process of being certified as a licensed processor. So trying to stay under that 1,000 bird limit if you plan on doing them yourselves. And then of course, over 20,000 birds, you have to go to a USDA inspected processing facility. And that's true too if you want to sell birds out of state. So Washington state is what's called a designated state. So they don't run a full meat inspection program, but there is this poultry exemption where you can have a state inspected poultry facility, but that only allows you to sell those within the state. So if you want to do interstate, you have to go to a USDA inspected facility. Oh, I asked for questions too soon. This is a guinea hen, in case anybody wasn't totally sure. Guineas are cool. Some people raise them for meat. They're great at killing ticks. All right, so moving right along, now the fun stuff, the actual production and raising of these animals. So we'll talk first about layers, because you can choose to do the brooding stage of layers or you can choose not to. So you can get chicks. Usually chicks are shipped as a day old straight from the hatchery, and then you would raise them in a brooder until they're old enough to go outside, and that varies based on the breed and kind of the temperature of where you're at and what sort of predators you have and so on. Or you can get pullets, which are birds at least 6 weeks old. And they're kind of a way to skip that sort of brooding stage where you can have a lot of loss in the brooding stage. And you have to be set up in order to brood. Whereas if you get pullets, they're closer to starting to lay their eggs. They may even be starting to lay eggs, though again, those eggs may be of various sizes and at different times. But if you're just doing it for your own personal production, maybe pullets are a good option. And then I think less likely to get them from a commercial source, but on Craigslist, there's always tons and tons of chickens. So if you just want to get an adult laying hen, obviously be careful if bringing birds into your flock. They might have different types of diseases. And as we mentioned before, the main productive area or length of time for a chicken can be fairly short. So you just want to make sure you're getting the chickens that you want and not, somebody's old hens that they're kind of trying to pass off onto you. And then, of course, going back to what we talked about before, you want to think about what sort of breed, whether you want a heritage breed, what color eggs you want to have, whether you want a variety of hens. And there's lots of recommendations out there from any number of blog sources on the internet about the benefits and pros and cons of different breeds. So if you decide to go with chicks, or if you're raising animals for meat, typically they'll start out in the brooder. Um, there are as many different ways to build a brooder as there are people who have brooders. This is kind of a nice one. I've used something similar to this before. It's a watering trough, so it's contained and pretty safe. But basically the key elements that you want to have are water, fresh water, age and species appropriate food with a feeder that they're able to use, clean bedding. I like to say that a clean brooder is a happy brooder, and a happy brooder is a healthy brooder. And this not only will it prevent you from losing chicks, but it'll give your chickens the best opportunity to grow and produce the the best eggs, the best meat in the fastest amount of time by making sure that they're really healthy. And then there's you need a warmth source, typically a lamp. You can get brooder lamps at Tractor Supply or anywhere or wherever. And the key is to make sure that it's warm enough and that you're changing based on the growing chick's needs. And there's lots of different resources out there that you can look at, kind of temperature requirements based on the age of your chicks. But a good rule of thumb is that if they're all huddled together, it's too cold. If they're all spread apart, it's too hot. And if they're sort of milling about like they are in this picture, you're probably at a pretty good temperature. Couple things to consider before you're buying or building your brooder is the size. So how many chickens you need. Can you expand it, or can you move them into multiple brooders? You know, the downside to something like this is that it's one size, and you either want to size it for the biggest that the chicks are going to get before you put them outside, or you want to make sure that you have a secondary space that you can split them into as they grow. Or you can do something like what this picture is showing, where you have panels or even cardboard. Pumpkin boxes work really great for this, where you can actually expand the brooder as the chicks grow before putting them outside. I would say one thing, there's people that run sort of combined flocks, particularly in backyard flocks, where they'll have chickens and maybe a couple turkeys or ducks. But I would say in the brooder specifically, you probably want to have just one species, just because the animals at this stage are really fragile and they can diseases can cross between the different species, and may not be you may have something that's a really big issue for your turkeys, but might not be for your chickens. So you don't want to sort of intersperse those diseases before they've built up their immunities. So yeah, mixed flocks are great, but not in the brooder. And then the last thing you want to think about is predator protection. So do you have rats or weasels or raccoons or dogs or birds? And just making sure that the chickens or turkeys, whatever at this delicate stage, are well protected, because they certainly can't protect themselves. So as they grow, you're going to go out into some sort of shelter. One of the key questions to ask yourself is, do you want it to be stationary or movable? And I would ask myself, how frequently, if it's going to be movable, am I really going to move it? And then, of course, you want to size your shelter based on the number of birds that you want to have, and make sure that it fits with your landscape, your slopes, everything like that. And people do a lot of different things. So the coop here is what I would consider fully enclosed. So the chickens, have access to the outdoors, but aren't necessarily out free ranging. There's folks that just let them range all across their yard, and they come into a barn or a coop at night, and that works well for some people. And then there's some areas, or some setups where you have, you know, a coop and then some electro netting or other sort of netting that maybe you can move so that there's an outdoor area, but it's more contained than just letting them free range kind of around all of your property. And if you do decide to go the mobile route, that's become really popular, whether it's for layers or for meat birds. There's endless designs to what type of shelter. And things kind of to consider here are, you know, how much effort do you want to put into it? Do you want to be able to move something like this mindful farmer one down here where you can kind of just pick it up and drag it around? Do you want to coop like the top photo where you have to drag it with a tractor? What kind of building materials are? And I just encourage you to be really creative about it. You know, building a chicken coop doesn't have to cost a fortune. It's just PVC pipe and chicken wire in it, and it works great, and you can move it easily. So just a couple of things to consider when you're considering what sort of shelter you want potentially for your future endeavors. Water is another place to get creative. These are a couple of examples of um, just different ways of setting up your water. So on the left, we have an automatic water system that's fed from a 5-gallon bucket. This 5-gallon bucket could be rain fed like it is in the right-hand photo. But in terms of water, you're going to be changing the water probably every day, if not every couple of days. So you want to think about like, how easy can I make it for myself? Um, and what, you know, what do I want chores to look like every day? I'd also say that collecting water into rain barrels for chickens in particular is great, in part because it'll cut down on mud by preventing roof runoff, and also because chickens are pretty sturdy stock once they get older. And so, you know, if you get algae or bugs or something in there, that's kind of par for the course for the chickens. And depending on, you know, where your water comes from, what you're paying for it, this can be a nice way to save a little bit in caring for your birds. And then food wise, I thought this photo was kind of hilarious. I think they called it a chicknick table. Um, there's so many different ways to feed and take care of your animals. But the things you want to consider are, you know, especially if you're considering doing a mixed flock, you know, do I have food that will work for each of these different types of birds, and providing the right source of grit? So chickens and turkeys have what's called a crop, which helps them break down their food. It's filled with like little rocks and it kind of grinds up. And as they age, and it varies also with the species, they need different sizes of rocks to fill in their crop. So it's important, especially if you don't have a lot of natural gravel around, to be able to provide that for them. And then if you have something that's laying eggs, you want to make sure that you have a calcium supplement like oyster shells or some other stuff. I think in the signups there was also a question about food scraps. And what I've found kind of through the research for this is that it depends on what the food is. So things that are not necessarily, you know, top quality for humans, whether it's processed food or things that are really high in fat or really high in sugar, you want to limit giving those to your chickens because it can throw off their digestive systems and that could impact your production. But things like vegetable scraps, pre-consumer bread or old day old bread, those sorts of things can be fine for chickens, and it's really a matter of watching them and making sure that you're balancing their diet. And of course, you know, double check with your vet, double check with your extension agent before, you know, going off on any sort of diet product. There was also a question about organic, and that's totally an option to you. I think a lot of folks nowadays are going organically raised, but not certified organic. And that again is just a personal choice. There's obviously a difference in feed cost, requirements, especially if you're selling them as or certified. But yeah, something else to consider. Okay, so let's move on to what could go wrong. And I've kind of grouped these into three categories. The first one being predation. I'll confess that this is a picture of a coyote eating a squirrel, not a chicken, but it seemed in poor taste to put a chicken up there. You can have health problems and then problems with environment. So things like mites and then mud would be a key sort of environmental concern. In terms of predation, the top 10 chicken predators are mostly rodents, with an assortment of other things thrown in. So raccoons, minks, weasels, possums. Possums was one that definitely surprised me getting into chicken production because they seem so small, but they can definitely take a chicken and certainly a chick. Bobcats, rats, coyotes, foxes, dogs, hawks, and owls. The first farm that I ever worked on, we had a small laying hen flock that us apprentices managed, and I came out one morning and there was a great horned owl in the chicken coop. It somehow had gotten in um, through the door. Like we had a self-closing chicken door, and thankfully we had a back door to the chicken coop, so I was able to open it and he flew out. But that was quite an experience. So owls are definitely definitely a chicken predator to be aware of. Couple ways to deter predators, particularly for owls or hawks, different aerial predators. String lines work really well. A lot of people use those, recommend it. It interferes with the hawk's eyesight, and can deter them from swooping down and picking up your chickens. If you're free ranging, um, you might be able to tie this from, the coop to your fences if you have that sort of fenced in setup. Or some people even put up like sort of nets on top of their main ranging areas to prevent aerial predation. And then again, with owls, they tend to hunt at night. And so making sure that your animals are inside at night can help cut down on losses in those sort of diurnal times of the day. Ground predators, you want to make sure that you've got a floor. A lot of these animals can dig right under if you're just on the ground. Having really secure doors. This is a depiction of a coop that has an automatic door. That can be a really good option, especially if you're out a lot, so that you don't have to go out every night and shut your chickens in. That can be a great option. And then if you are like truly free ranging or you have high productivity, it might be worthwhile to consider getting a guardian dog, or a guardian animal of some sort. People use llamas, donkeys. I have seen a couple of photos of guardian geese, which is kind of an interesting option. But yeah, having an animal out there that is bigger and stronger and scarier that can protect your animals might end up being the right option for you, depending. And I just love this photo. This is a photo I took from a farm in upstate New York, and this is Luna. She's a great poultry guardian dog. And they're pretty stinking cute. So that's an extra benefit of having the guardian dog. Happy to answer more specific questions or point you in more directions if you're having specific predation issues. And we'll turn now to kind of common ailments. Ooh, sorry, I didn't give you a warning. Gross photos. Um, so kind of the most common thing that you'll run into are mites or lice. So that's that kind of top left photo there that's showing mites along the cloaca, which is the egg and um, excrement hole that chickens have. Mites can be really hassling. Some of them, most of them are not zoonotic with human, but there are certain types of mites and lice that you can get. So just something to be aware of. They may cause decrease in production, they might cause defeathering, different issues, and they can be hard to get rid of, although people have good success with either mite sprays or diatomaceous earth. And really the key with them is prevention, having a nice clean area. Being able to move your animals can help a lot with mites, but sometimes they just show up and it's a pain. Another issue that's common, especially in young birds, is coccidia. So this is a parasite that grows in the intestinal tracts, and it can cause bloody stools. That's like the most common sign of coccidia. And they do make what are called coccidia stats, which is like a chemical deterrent to coccidia. But often folks can feed them foods high in tannins that can add to sort of the natural immunity to coccidia. And the key with that is making sure that you isolate, sick birds so that they're not spreading the coccidia through other birds eating contaminated food with their feces. The upper the upper right photo, sorry, that one's particularly gross. This was an issue we had last year, especially as we've had these kind of surprise freezes. This is a hen that had been trying to lay an egg, and either the mucus or the egg itself or something froze. So we actually had to go in and kind of pull the egg and the mucus that was frozen off of her. We were able to, bandage her up a little bit, sanitize it, and send her on her way, and she lived. But something to be aware of, especially as we have kind of crazier winters, that you definitely want to keep an eye out. In particular, too, I also have cannibalism on here. So that bright red blood area is really attractive to other chickens. So we had some issues with chickens pecking each other, attracted to those bright red blood spots, or if a chicken dies, they'll often eat each other. Um, something something that I just think you should be aware of so that you know kind of what you're getting into. Poultry are great birds, but um, there can be sort of less desirable things that happen in your flock, and I think it's important to be kind of prepared for and come into what you're doing wide open so you're not shocked. Um, and then the last thing that's super common is an infection commonly known as bumblefoot. It's actually a staph infection. And that's what you can see down here in the bottom. It becomes a problem. Well, it can eventually, if the infection gets bad enough, it can kill your birds. But it's also a problem if you're producing, meat birds, because you can't sell a foot like this. If you're trying to eke out sort of every dollar of your chicken, selling chicken feet can be an important part of your business, and so you want to make sure that you're preventing bumblefoot. And the best way to prevent that is just to have really clean areas. So again, that might be another consideration for whether you want a mobile or a stationary structure. With mobile structures, if you're moving them a lot, it's probably easier to keep things clean, but certainly not impossible to prevent things like bumblefoot with a stationary coop. And then the last kind of big disease we'll talk about is avian influenza. You may have heard in the news about Hearth and Haven Farm that recently had their whole flock of ducks euthanized. They're up in Snohomish County. They unfortunately had somehow gotten a bird infected with the highly pathogenic avian influenza. They lost some birds, saw egg production decline, did the right thing and sent their bird, one of their dead birds, into the WSDA for testing. It unfortunately came back. positive. And at that point, the WSDA's policy is that they euthanize the entire flock, and then you're not able to raise more poultry for, I think, 3 years. I'd have to double check that in order to allow the disease to dissipate. Avian influenza can come from, other flocks or even just from wild birds. So that's one caution I would mention, is particularly people interested in ducks, is that if you have ducks, you definitely want to keep them away from wild waterfowl in order to give yourself the best chance of avoiding avian influenza. The low pathogenic influenza, less of an issue. You might not even notice symptoms, but definitely something to be aware of. Um, and this is just a list at the bottom of who to call if you find a dead bird or having some of these issues. So the last kind of category we had was these sort of environmental issues. And this is near and dear to the conservation district's heart for sure. And things you want to consider are like, what are you going to do with your waste? Particularly whether you have a stationary coop or you've got mobile coops, because those have very different impacts, whether you need to pick it up and clean it, whether you need to, shovel out, build up. You'd be surprised at how quickly poultry manure can build up. And so you want to have a place to put that that's safe, that's not going to lead to runoff into water sources. And ideally compost it if you can. Again, poultry manure can be really great fertilizer, but you want to make sure that you're handling it with care for yourself and for the natural environment. Chickens, ducks, turkeys, whatever poultry you've got, you would be shocked at how much mud they can make. They're omnivores, and so they'll eat grass, and you can have issues with overgrazing just like you would with horses or cattle or sheep with your chickens. Again, maybe a reason to have a mobile structure versus a permanent structure so you can move them around. But again, you'd actually want to move them. Think about, what your actual availability is, because you can end up with real mud issues, kind of every time you move your chicken coop if you're not moving it fast enough. And that can be a real quick way to do some serious damage and reduce your overall land productivity. That might be an issue for other grazing in particular enterprises that you might have. Some ways to prevent that is having a sacrifice area like the conservation district would recommend for any other sort of animal, and having specific footing, specific place that you can put these animals in the winter, um, to sort of minimize the overall impact and concentrate it in one area that you're able to manage. And that's definitely a place where the conservation district is able to provide a lot of advice and even some financial assistance for making these sorts of sacrifice areas to minimize impacts, especially during the winter. And really the purpose of all that is to prevent runoff, to reduce erosion. With poultry in particular, I think that's extra important just because there are so many things, so many bacteria that poultry carry that can be zoonotic, where like Salmonella or E. coli or Campylobacter. I think it's especially important when raising poultry to be conscious about, what's around you, where your water is running into, what you're doing to dispose of your waste, that sort of thing. And then another thing that I certainly didn't consider until I needed to, was how to store all this stuff. Chicken feed is really tasty to all sorts of creatures, especially different rodents, rats, mice. And so you want to be careful that you're not attracting other pests to your property, especially if you're in town and have neighbors. You don't want to be, the mouse and rat house on the street because you're improperly storing either your feed or your bedding or even the waste itself. Um, making sure that that's contained in an enclosed space is really important, especially if you're in town. And then, of course, we want to make sure that that we're being safe for our humans. So I love this photo. Kids seem to find a way to put their mouth on anything. The CDC actually a couple years ago had the big campaign to get folks to stop kissing their chickens. Chickens, ducks, turkeys, geese, all of the poultry can carry bacteria that may not make them sick, but will definitely make you sick, particularly Salmonella, E. coli, and Campylobacter, which cause some pretty nasty intestinal stuff. Often treatable, but I would say play it safe. Obviously love your animals. I love, you saw the picture of me with the turkey on my shoulder. Handle them, but then make sure you're having really good hygiene. And probably don't kiss them, and like definitely don't lick them. I would say as a as a starting point. And then the other thing to note, especially if you have young kids or other animals around, is that any animal, when it's feeling attacked or even just sort of ornery, can scratch you. Roosters in particular are notorious for being unpredictable and sometimes mean. Obviously, there's I've met plenty of nice roosters and nice male animals of other poultry species, but something to be aware of: roosters have spurs that can cause a pretty serious puncture wound. So something to be aware of. And then, I have gotten whacked in the face with more bird wings, mostly through processing, than I would really like to. So just want to make sure that you're thinking about, safety, both from a sort of internal and external perspective. All right. Now what? So, this is just a list, and I'll send, if folks would like, I can share a PDF of the slides and have these all linked. Some of my favorite resources, some of the resources that the Conservation District really recommends, are NCAT ATRA, that's the National Center for Appropriate Technology. That's their sustainable agriculture arm. They put out a lot of publications, some videos about various animal husbandry and resource concerns. Really great resource. Similarly, there's SARE, which is the Sustainable Agriculture Research something. They also put out a lot of publications about any sort of topic in agriculture that you could think of, from feed to animal husbandry to cover crops, whatever you name it. WSU Extension, also a great resource. They have a lot of great staff that can come and talk to you specifically about your concerns, and they also have a huge variety of publications and webinars that you can attend for information. If you're not familiar with it, the USDA Food Safety and Inspection Service, or FSIS, has plenty of information about food safety as well as inspection programs. They also, interestingly, put out a notice every week about food recalls. And if you've never looked at that, I encourage you to check it out. You'd be surprised what and why meat products get recalled throughout the US. And they also, in addition to meat products, they also deal with eggs. Marble seed is another sustainable agricultural resource. They used to be called Moses, which is the Midwest Sustainable Ag Consortium. Heifer USA is a great resource. They have a lot of farmer training videos, lots of videos about building brooders. That was the place that I worked with the largest amount of birds. They're doing big prairie schooners, batches of 1,000 birds, but they also have guidance for small and backyard producers. Farm Commons, that's a resource for legal issues. The Livestock Conservancy, good place to get information about different types of breeds that you might be interested in. And then the American Pastured Poultry Producers Association, which is a mouthful, is another great resource that specializes obviously in pastured poultry, but also has just general information about raising birds. And I think they have a pretty active online community where you can ask questions, talk to other producers to see what's working. And get on Facebook, get on Craigslist. There's lots of small homesteader backyard groups. Talking to other producers is really really invaluable. Having a mentor, and just having other people that are kind of going through it with you is really really key to being successful and having places that you can turn when issues inevitably arise. So there's lots of resources out there. Pierce Conservation District obviously is happy to also be a resource. We're more focused on kind of the land, natural resources, but more than happy to point you in the direction, try to answer any questions that we can. And yeah, that's kind of where we're at. Happy to take any questions. Um, Otherwise, thank you so much for coming. Hopefully you learned something. And yeah.